Now to a quite different story, I think, Paul Carroll coming up. I had a tough time getting here to Belgium, but I'm very happy to have him here in the end, and I hope he's still awake after the jet lag. But Paul, thank you for being here.
So I am delighted to be here for at least a couple reasons. First, I believe very much in this topic. I'm delighted what Karen and her folks are doing. I've been writing about failure for a while and think it's really important to study failures as well as success stories. And I'm just delighted to be able to pitch in how I can. I will say I think we're making progress on this front. If you look at the way the dialogue goes in the US, people are more willing to entertain the notion of failure than they used to be. It's largely because of a book called The Lean Startup, and people tend to talk about failure in terms of learning rather than just straight on failure, but in any case, that's progress. I'm also delighted to be here because I lived in Brussels for 3 years back in the 1980s, and this is only my second trip back since I left in 1986. I'm further delighted that I'm going to be getting on a plane tomorrow because the last time I went home, I sailed. I went with some friends up to Ostend, and we got in a 42-foot sailboat and sailed to Cape May, New Jersey, getting in 27 days later after more storms than I care to remember. So anyway, the idea of getting on an actual plane tomorrow rather than a sailboat is quite attractive to me. So I'm really here because I wrote a book on failures. I'd like to think it's the book on failures, but in any case, it's a book on failures. It seems that I'm attracted to failures. My nickname around the Wall Street Journal, where I spent 17 years, became Dr. Death after a while, because I had started covering IBM in 1986, and it was the dominant company in the world. By the time I stopped covering IBM in 1993, there were rumors of possible bankruptcy. So then I moved to Mexico City, where I ran the bureau for 2.5 years for the Wall Street Journal. Mexico was the darling of the developing world when I got there. By the time I left, it had a devaluation, first major assassination in a long time. It looked like the economy was failing so badly it was going to take down the US economy and with it most of the rest of the world. When I moved back to the US, to the San Francisco bureau of the Wall Street Journal, an old friend of mine who worked in PR for Intel called me and begged me not to cover the company. He said he would pay me real money if I would find something else to cover. But I did cover Intel, and the chip industry went into a 2-year recession. So in the mid 2000s, as I was reading some things by Jim Collins, who's been so successful with his success stories and the very rigorous research he does on those, it occurred to me that nobody had ever looked at failures. Collins says, here's how to be like those guys, but nobody ever said, here's how not to be like those guys. So I did the flip side of Jim Collins. Another guy and I got a consulting firm where we'd been partners together for some years to give us 20 researchers, and over the space of 2 years, we looked at 2,500 failures and came up with some patterns that basically said, okay, here's how not to be like those guys. When you combine that with the writing work, which turned out to be the hardest I'd ever done, and then some additional work we've done in terms of innovation and how not to fail at innovation, especially with big companies, it's about 5 years of my life that I've spent looking at failures. Not all of them are appropriate for this group because most of them were in big corporations, but what I'll do is tell you a little bit about what I learned to try to help you guys avoid some of these failures. And then I'll give you a couple observations to try to tailor it more specifically to the kind of thing you're dealing with. And then in the spirit of acknowledging failure, I'll tell you my failure story. So when we looked at failures, it turns out, first of all, that a lot of them were predictable. And that was a surprise to me. I figured you have these huge companies with all these smart folks, and they're disciplined enough that they're not going to make obvious mistakes. But even though we tried to be very fair to companies and not ding them for things they couldn't foresee, like 9/11 in the case of the airlines, or some changes in regulation in the US that made life insurance companies compete much more with mutual funds than they ever had before, we still decided that 46% of the strategies we looked at were obviously stupid. And I mean stupid. So you had Federal Express deciding back in the early 80s that if absolutely positively overnight was great, then absolutely positively that afternoon would be even better. Well, that's a great idea, but what it basically meant is that they thought they were the only people who would ever discover the fax machine. So what would happen is they would send somebody to your office, pick up a document, take it to a FedEx center, FedEx it to near where you wanted the document to go, have it delivered then to that office. It worked fine for about a year, but then, lo and behold, other people discovered the wonders of fax machines, and FedEx's $350 million investment went down the drain. Avon decided that it wasn't really about cosmetics or about its door-to-door sales force. It decided it was about what they called a culture of caring. And once they defined themselves that way, they bought retirement homes. They bought a medical equipment company. They pretty quickly lost their shirt and actually sold them back to the people they'd bought them from, who went on to do very nicely with those businesses because they actually knew how to run them. My favorite example was a British cement company, Blue Circle, that decided it really was in the home products business, not the cement business, because so much of its product was used in homes. So Blue Circle, which was I think the 5th biggest cement company in the world at that point, went off and started making lawnmowers and boilers and other products for homes. Pretty quickly went bankrupt and was bought by a large French company, Lafarge. And the list goes on and on and on. Kodak is a company that we covered at some length. That was crazy because Kodak actually invented the sensor that enabled digital photography. And they did a study in the early 1980s about how digital photography would play out and nailed it. I know this because a friend of mine did the study. He later went on to become the top guy in terms of strategy at General Motors and is the reason that OnStar is in GM products and has done so well. Well, Vince just nailed this prediction of how things would go at Kodak. And Kodak looked at that and decided the real lesson was, oh, we don't have to worry about digital photography for 10 years. They just put it aside, didn't do anything with it. When they finally got around to thinking about digital photography, they thought of it as something that they could manage and could sort of work into film cameras. So they actually spent $500 million developing a camera called the Advantix, which was fully digital, but to use, you had to use film as well. All you could do was look at the back of the camera and see what a picture looked like and decide whether you were going to print it. But to actually consume the photos, to look at them, you had to still print them out. So that was the first surprise, that so many of these things were easily, predictably stupid. Then you get to the next level of detail, and we found that there were 7 types of strategies that were most commonly associated with failure. They're not all applicable, and it would take me too long to go through them all, but these were things like synergy. The AOL Time Warner deal was the biggest failure in terms of synergy. But if you look at a lot of businesses, they assume that if you have a little of this and you add a little of that, they're going to work better together. And in our experience, companies were very often kidding themselves. The cost synergies were reasonably straightforward and easy to get, but people tended to forget that, oh, if you cut up Salesforce or whatever, that's also going to have an impact on the revenue side. So in most cases, the revenue synergies that people expected were ephemeral. By the way, to make sure that we were not just doing Monday morning quarterbacking, we started a blog that would predict how different things would do. We actually wound up getting some attention because early on we said that the AOL Time Warner deal was stupid, and there were a few others that we predicted would fall apart. I'll tell you today that this EMC deal with Dell is an example of synergy that won't happen. So mark your calendars and look at it in 5 years or whatever, and that's going to wind up being a failed deal. The way private equity works, they may still make some money off it, Silver Lake and Dell himself, but the company itself will not do very well. So synergy is one that if you're basing a strategy on, you ought to be careful. Another is adjacencies. That's basically what Avon did when it decided that cosmetics was actually close to nursing homes and medical equipment. In some cases, it can work if your customers are trying to pull you in a certain direction. But in a lot of cases, when people decide that something is an adjacent market, they're not understanding enough what the complexities are of the new market. Roll-ups were one that didn't work very well. Those seem to be sort of out of style. Technology issues came up in almost all cases. I would say in this group, that's probably not something you need to worry about too much. You're probably on top of the technology enough. But in any case, there are these 7 strategies that are most commonly associated with failure. So you go to another level of abstraction. We tried to look across the strategies to figure out what the biggest dangers were. And there was really one that leapt to our attention, and that's that people would often confuse size with scale and wouldn't understand that often with the additional size came considerable additional complexity that would outweigh the benefits that would come with scale. Hospitals are a great example of this. If you guys follow Clay Christensen, who's written a lot about disruption and innovation, he would argue, and has argued in a quite good book called The Innovator's Prescription, that hospitals are just wildly complex. And people sort of assume that if you've got the X-ray department down the hall from the orthopedics department or whatever, then that works pretty well. But in fact, hospitals are so complex to run that they are incredibly efficient operations. And he argues that, correctly I believe, that people are going to wind up sort of taking slices, if you will, out of the hospital market. So you'll have joint replacements done in a very efficient assembly line sort of operation where all you do is joint replacements, and lots of other things will disappear from hospitals as well. So there are others, but the main one is don't just think that because you're getting bigger, somehow you're going to be able to spread your operating expenses across more revenue and become more efficient, because it's not necessarily going to happen. The final level of abstraction, which is probably the most relevant across all groups, is that the main reason these stupid strategies were not headed off is because businesses lacked what we call a devil's advocate. I decided back when my wife and I were sometimes buying homes and remodeling them that the most expensive words were "while we're at it." You know, while the wall is open, while we're doing this, whatever. Well, in the world of business, I think the most expensive words are "we have to do something." In these big businesses, you'll have people who will see that a drug is going off patent, and they'll say, "we have to do something." So the issue doesn't become, is making this acquisition absolutely the right thing to do? It's, well, we have to do something. And this acquisition is maybe the best way we can possibly get to our goal. So the way to head that off is to have someone whose sole responsibility in a boardroom setting is to be the devil's advocate. What that means is that the person has license, even responsibility, to challenge everything. The way things tend to go, especially in big businesses, the bigger you get, the more these group dynamics kick in, but this also happens in smaller businesses, is that once somebody has an idea, especially if it's a senior person, everything goes to supporting that idea. You want to try to prove the CEO right. You want to make this happen. You want to assume good things are going to come together for you. So what you need to do is step back and understand what exactly might be involved in that. So you put all the assumptions on the table. Customers have to do this. The economy has to do this. The technology has to be there for this, and so forth. So you get it all out there. And once you get that all on the table, then you can make a much more rational decision. Some of the details on how you do a devil's advocate get a little tricky, especially in big businesses. If you're always known as the person who's challenging things, that's a pretty good way to get shot. So sometimes you can designate somebody to be the devil's advocate, and you can sort of rotate it. Sometimes you bring in outsiders. That's what my co-author and I, Chunka Moy, have done with a fair number of businesses. We've gone in and served as the devil's advocate, because that way, once we're done, we're gone, and there are no political repercussions left behind from our dealings with folks. But in any case, there has to be some way to sort of separate the analysis from the decision. And in most businesses, it happens simultaneously. Somebody knows that something needs to be done. They come up with a hypothesis about how things ought to change to address the problem. And the analysis and the solution are kind of being done at the same time. We tell the story about how the Persians, who did a pretty good job ruling the world for about 300 years, used to make decisions twice, once while sober and once while drunk. If the decisions agreed, then the Persians moved ahead. If the decisions didn't agree, then they stepped back and took a look at additional things. Usually in a setting like this, people assume, let's go to the bar. Let's make the decision after a couple of glasses of something. But in fact, the way the dynamics work in business is the normal decision is much more like the drunk decision than it is like the sober decision. And the devil's advocate approach is a way of enforcing some sobriety in the decision making. As I say, it gets sort of complicated, but at least thinking in terms of having a devil's advocate is the right way to do things, even in small businesses. So there's a lot more research. As I say, this is 5 years of my life, and if any of you want to talk about this, I can go on for hours and bore you all. But I'd say there are two observations sort of based on this that I'd make that may be useful. I hope they are. One sort of relates to this research, but actually goes back even a little further. As Karen said, I was at the Wall Street Journal for 17 years, including 7 years in New York, where I started covering the world of technology. And it turns out if you're in New York with the Wall Street Journal, you have a lot of people who want to visit you. It not only happens when you work at the Wall Street Journal. I used to go around to conferences, and I'd have a big press ribbon hanging from the badge and so forth, and I'd have to take my ribbon off and hang it, because even though most people had no idea who I was, once they saw the Wall Street Journal name on it, I couldn't go 10 feet without getting tackled. Well, when you're in New York, you not only have the normal sorts of folks who come through, but basically every other business is coming through at some point because they're talking to the financial analysts. So beyond IBM and the companies I covered, I used to see Bill Gates all the time, and Michael Dell would come through, and Scott McNealy when he ran Sun, and Larry Ellison of Oracle, and all these folks. I was also curious enough that I took a lot of meetings with startups. I was just sort of curious to see what was going on. And one day I realized that I'd had 3 meetings with broke entrepreneurs and 3 meetings with some of the smartest folks in the industry. And if you hadn't told me what their net worth was, I'd have had no idea how to distinguish between them. They were all equally bright as far as I was concerned. And I sort of made a study over the years trying to figure out what the correlation was between intelligence and huge business success. And I decided that there was one in the sense that you had to be a certain level of intellect, you had to have a certain level of drive and so forth. But beyond that, there really wasn't a lot of correlation. And that may be discouraging. It may tell you that what you need is a fair amount of luck, but I actually took it as encouraging, because I can tell you that without knowing a lot of you, just knowing this sort of group and having talked to this sort of group, you know, Bill Gates, I would say, is different. He's just wildly smart. Steve Jobs was different. He just had a different sense of the world. But you guys would fit in just fine with any other group of folks I've dealt with. I would actually tell you I was stunned over the years to decide that Michael Dell is really not very bright. Nice guy. I liked him. I liked his manner. Most people of that caliber have come through with an entourage, and Michael would just show up with his cell phone. And it was kind of goofy in the days before 9/11 when security got really stepped up. He would just come up to the reporter's floor and he'd knock on the window, and the receptionist would call me and say, "Hey, Michael's here." And he and I would go grab a cup of coffee in the cafeteria. But he's a guy who was in the right place at the right time. The Dell creation myth is that he saw early on that build to order was the way to go. But I actually know that not to be true, because I interviewed him before he had that vision. I met him when he was 22 or 23, and actually the only reason he wanted to talk to me is he desperately wanted his products to be carried in retail stores. Well, the only reason he succeeded, as he did, is because he wasn't carried in retail stores. He basically was the best of the mail order folks when the internet came along, and that positioned him perfectly to do the sort of mail order stuff. But he was lucky. And there also have been people who have been almost right and whose names you could have heard of. There's a guy, Jerry Kaplan, who invented the iPhone 15 years too early. That's actually how I met my wife. She worked for him at the time. Jerry also almost invented eBay. He started a business called On Sale because he saw the potential for online auctions back in, this was 95 or 96. The problem was he decided he would buy old or used, refurbished, whatever electronics equipment and actually take physical possession of it and then resell it. So he wound up having a very successful business, and you don't need to feel bad for Jerry because he came away with about $20 million when he sold the business. But he was this close to having the idea for eBay. A guy who showed up in our research for $1 billion lessons is somebody who's sort of the flip side of that. This guy had a sterling reputation. I mean, he was being listed on magazine covers as roughly the equivalent of Jack Welch. And he had lots of reason to claim business success. He's sort of the one who discovered the quality idea in Japan and brought it back to the US as Six Sigma. He became the CEO of Motorola and so forth. But he had, in $1 billion lessons, 2 failures attributed to him out of the 7 major failures we focused on in the book. He was the CEO at Motorola when they decided to do Iridium, which, as you may recall, was a satellite phone that was just doomed from the beginning because the physics don't work. I mean, satellite phones just don't work well inside buildings, and the idea that this was going to be a major competitor for cell phones only worked if you compared where the technology for Iridium would be in 15 years with where the cell phone technology was when Iridium was launched. I actually saw one of the first Iridium phones to come out, and I could barely pick it up. It weighed so much. And a minute of airtime cost $5. So it was just ludicrous, but he was the CEO who did that. And then he became the CEO of Kodak. Well, when Roberto Goizueta, the CEO of Coca-Cola, was asked how they did the job search and settle on George Fisher, he said, well, we started with God and then worked our down in the search until we came to George. Well, Fisher is the guy who decided that you could balance digital and analog photography. He's the one who did the Advanix camera. He's the one who basically set Kodak up for massive failure. And it's a little bit of a long way of saying that there is a certain level that is required, but beyond that, in my experience, there is a lot of luck involved, and there just are a lot of factors that have to come together. But if you fail, that doesn't mean you're not as good an executive or entrepreneur or whatever as Bill Gates or any of the rest of these folks. This actually is a lesson that I tell my daughters a lot. One of them's about to graduate from Berkeley, and the other's a sophomore at Yale, so they're accomplished young women. I don't tell them that they can do anything that boys can do just because I never want them to have that thought in their heads. I don't even want to have to raise that as a question to be answered. But I do tell them that they can succeed in anything they care to, because I've met Bill Gates, I dealt with Steve Jobs, I've corresponded with Warren Buffett, I had a cigar with Carlos Slim. I've dealt with some of the most impressive business folks in the world, and my daughters will measure up just fine if they choose to go that route. So anyway, so that's one observation that I would make in terms of startups. As somebody was saying earlier, you can go ahead and I believe, think big, because big successes are possibly out there. The other thing that I would say, volume matters. You're only going to have a certain chance of succeeding each time, so the more times you try, the more likely you are to succeed. There's a guy who I don't think is all that well known in Europe, except maybe because he's Dirk Nowitzki's employer, but he's a big deal in the US, a guy named Mark Cuban. And Cuban owns the Dallas Mavericks. He also has a TV show called Shark Tank that's sort of the smart version of the stuff that Donald Trump does. And he and I went to high school together. He's a year younger than I am. And I can tell you that the fact that he's worth about $6 billion more than I am doesn't have to do with the fact that he's, a bazillion times smarter than I am, because he was a nobody in high school. He just was somebody who was relentless in things that he tried, and he went through 6 or 7 startups before he finally settled on something that actually, in retrospect, was not a good idea. He decided he could do video on the internet about 20 years ago when the technology wasn't there to enable that. But he did succeed enough that he got Yahoo to buy him and then was smart enough to sell and so forth. So go ahead and dream big, but then try as many times as you can. Those would be the 2 ways I would adapt the research we did on failure to this sort of audience. Now, I don't really know how much time I have left, but I'll give you a quick version of my failure story. So it took me till I was 45 to really hit the wall. In fact, I thought it was funny, a guy I don't really know very well told me the other day that he described me to somebody, as having had the perfect first 22 years. I don't know why he stopped at 22, because I thought things went well for a while after that. But just smart kid, skipped a grade in grade school, graduated from high school when I was 16, had the kind of grades and SAT scores that would have gotten me into any college in the country. Graduated from college at 19, because I went through quickly, had a master's degree from Northwestern when I was 20. My whole goal in my career, which I knew was to be as a journalist. I'd fallen in love with journalism since hearing my dad's stories when I was 5 or 6 years old. My career goal was to make it to a major national newspaper at some point. Well, when I was just past my 22nd birthday, the Wall Street Journal hired me. So 22 years old, and I basically had met my career goal. And it actually got better from there, because when I showed up, the paper was going through some change. And a guy named Norm Pearlstein came in as the national editor and sort of adopted a few of us. So pretty soon, at age 23, I was running the news desk for the Wall Street Journal in New York. At age 25, I was sent here to Brussels to run the editing operation at this very high-profile startup, the Wall Street Journal Europe. Went back to the US, covered IBM, wound up covering the near demise, wrote a big bestseller on IBM's problems. Go off to Mexico City, get nominated twice for a Pulitzer Prize. I'm a finalist once. Even had my sort of deep throat moment when I got a senior member of the Mexican government to show up at my house unannounced, afraid that he was going to be killed if he was found talking to me and so forth. Leave the journal in '96, go to this startup that turned out to be very enterprising. The founder had the idea all the way back in 1994 that information technology should drive corporate strategy rather than just be an add-on. And he founded this very successful company where I was employee number 85. I did a magazine for the consulting firm that, even though it was a small circulation issue, wound up being a finalist for the National Magazine Award for General Excellence, which is like getting a Best Picture nomination for the Oscars. But then things fell apart. The internet bubble burst, and while we had a real business, we were tied enough to that we went from $500 million in annual revenue to about 140. We went from a $4 billion market cap to about a $75 billion market cap. It was even worse than that, actually, when you consider that we had about $100 million in cash. So the market wasn't telling us that the business itself was a whole lot at a $75 million valuation. So I got laid off, as did a whole bunch of folks, and got laid off at a time when the world of journalism was falling apart. Right? It was great for a while, but with the internet coming along, the whole business model had disappeared. My little brother, who stayed on at the Wall Street Journal as an editor and just hit 33 years there, about every 4 years gets a memo saying, "Consider yourself fired. You may not reapply for your old job." And he's made the cut every time, but that's the sort of market I was trying to get back into. So I did what any normal person would do. I sulked for about 3 years. Lost some weight, did a lot of cycling, played a lot of golf, but basically just went into a funk. And then finally decided I needed to do something. And it turned out that just the mere act of sort of getting moving again was very helpful, because I did a project with Bill Gates. I almost wrote a book with a very well-known poker player, and that sort of got me back in circulation enough that I came up with the idea for billion-dollar lessons. That led to other work on the National Broadband Plan, a similar thing at the Department of Energy, another book, an internet startup, insurance-related publishing startup that I'm running now and have been for the last couple of years, and a whole bunch of other things. So I guess from a personal standpoint, I would say don't sulk. Keep moving. Try to find interesting places to work, like I think insurance will be, because it's going to be disrupted very heavily from here on. And I just wish you a lot of luck. Thanks.